Russia has suffered its worst battlefield losses since the start of the war, but does it make a difference? Because Moscow is still managing to recruit more men than it's losing, and Ukraine is not. And Britain has warned the world is entering a new nuclear age. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And from today, we have launched a new membership scheme. So if you'd like to become a member of this show, please click the link, which should be showing now, and you'll be able to join a number of different tiers, get access to exclusive content, new badges and icons, which will allow your questions in the comments to get priority, help us get to know you and get you to get to know each other. Russian losses in November were reportedly the highest they have been at any point in the war as it approaches nearly 3 years of conflict. More than 45,000 Russian soldiers were allegedly killed or maimed over that month, and that is the third month in a row that Russia has suffered record losses, according to figures published by Britain's Defence Intelligence. They said the death toll, or rather the toll for dead and wounded, was some 41,000 in October. In November, that meant that they averaged around 1,500 dead and wounded a day, with one day, the 28th of November, being the bloodiest, some 2,030 soldiers killed or maimed, the first time in more than 1,000 days of conflict that they've suffered more than 2,000 casualties in a single day. Now, we've talked about how this has become a battle of attrition, both sides grinding each other down, trying to wear the other one out. And these reports of these eye-watering Russian losses often lead us to believe that the war is unsustainable, that they cannot go on fighting like this forever. And yet, I was at an event yesterday where a former four-star British general, who was once the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Sir James Everard, made the point in very clear language that in terms of numbers, Russia is winning. I mean, not only is it continuing to advance, it is taking ground at one of the fastest rates since the war began. Fundamentally, he said, Russia is recruiting more men and women than it is losing in battle, and Ukraine is losing more men and women than it is managing to recruit. So fundamentally, unless something changes, that is an unsustainable direction of travel, unsustainable sort of graph for Ukraine to be on at the moment. But nonetheless, if you look at those figures from UK Defence Intelligence, citing that its source for much of this information is in fact the Ukrainian General Staff. And I think that does raise some doubts about the credibility, because obviously both sides in this conflict have an interest in inflating the reports of the other side's losses. But nonetheless, it is a really staggering graph to look at when you see the tiers, the sort of rate, the average rate of losses that Russia suffered over the 3 years, 2022, 2023 and 2024. I mean, broadly speaking, going from, you know, the low hundreds in the first year to around, the high hundreds in the second year, and then to 1,000 and now up to 1,500 at the end of 2024. And why has that death toll increased so much? Well, probably because Russia has ramped up the tempo of operations. We've seen, significant Russian attempts to gain ground in Kursk, in its own sovereign soil, where Ukraine has captured that pocket, in Kupiansk, in eastern Kharkiv, in Toretsk, in Pokrovsk, where they've in sort of southeastern Donetsk, where Russia has been advancing for some weeks, particularly around Kharkova, south of Pokrovsk, and also in Velika Novosilka. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So there has been this increased tempo of Russian operations. And we've seen some really unpleasant examples of that fighting from both sides in Kherson. Horrific drone footage, research by the Financial Times suggesting that it looks like Russian soldiers are using civilians for target practice, in their language, in Kherson city, trying to force civilians out of that regional capital. It was the only regional capital Russia captured during the course of the conflict, and it's since been recaptured by Ukraine. I've also seen this morning what appears to be really, really unpleasant footage of Ukrainian drone operators dropping mortars and then a grenade on a very seriously wounded Russian soldier, both sides being driven to very unpleasant extremes. Not drawing parity, there has been significantly more examples of clear-cut war crimes by the Russians, but nonetheless, the nature of conflict is horrific, and we see examples of that horror from both sides. Why has the tempo of operations increased? Well, that's possibly because there's a feeling now that we've turned a corner, that we've entered a new phase of the war where both sides feel like they're approaching what may be the end game of the conflict. And in one sense, that's excellent news, because anything that brings this conflict to a swift end will hopefully be a good thing. And the reason for that sort of change in direction, or that change of tempo, there's a sense that, particularly from Ukraine and its allies, there is an appetite for peace talks. Now, how do we know that? Well, the mood from the soldiers that we've spoken to is really one of sort of deep fatigue. Now, Ukrainians have been tired since the first months of this war, but they've fought through that fatigue and that exhaustion because they have no choice. They're fighting this existential war of survival. But we've heard from President Zelensky in an interview with Sky News. He said in public for the first time that he would consider ceding territory in exchange for NATO membership. Now, that idea was first mooted by a NATO official over a year ago. When it came out, it caused much consternation, it caused upset in Kyiv, but nonetheless, that is now from President Zelensky suggesting that's a position he would accept. So that would likely mean ceding ground that has already been lost in exchange for cast iron security guarantees, membership of NATO, so that were Russia to try and take more ground, it would be taking it from NATO, and that would become an Article 5 confrontation. You just need to look at the countries which are in NATO, former sort of Russian colonies that were captured by the USSR, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They have not been affected by sort of direct Russian aggression, but the other territories that wanted to join NATO but didn't make it in, Georgia and Ukraine, they clearly have. That's why Zelensky wants that guarantee. We've also heard from Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, at a foreign ministers meeting this week in Brussels, saying that their priority, NATO's priority, is to get Ukraine in the strongest possible position for peace talks. And indeed, we heard from Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who gave a speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet here in London, saying the same thing, saying that the sort of objective now was to get Ukraine into the strongest position for peace talks. And I spoke to a British general this week who said, he was surprised to hear that, because that is a sort of distinct departure from the previous policy statements, which was that the UK's position was to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Now, that language of as long as it takes is still being used, and Ukraine's allies are very clear. They keep saying that it's for Ukraine to decide when it's ready to negotiate. But of course, we can't escape that all of this is happening in the sort of shadow of, or in the countdown really, to Donald Trump returning to the White House on January the 20th, when he will be inaugurated as the next American president. And he has made no secret of his desire to end this war very, very quickly. So what we're likely seeing is an uptick in the tempo of operations as Russia really tries to improve its position to take as much ground as it can before those negotiations start. Ukraine also trying to defend its positions as well as it can, particularly that pocket of sovereign Russian territory in Kursk to use as a bargaining chip. One more thing to note on that is that Andriy Yermak, the right-hand man of President Zelensky, former producer of his production company, film producer, and now one of his closest aides, has said in an interview with The Telegraph that he sees no appetite from Russia. He says that Russia does not appear to be ready to negotiate. And indeed, the music coming out of the Kremlin is that they don't see that negotiations are sort of on the table yet. Nonetheless, impossible to escape the fact that negotiations are an emerging theme ever louder. I want to talk now about the new nuclear age, the third nuclear age that the Chief of Britain's Defence Staff said that the world had entered when he delivered his annual lecture to the Royal United Servicemen's Institute last night in London. He said that this nuclear age is the most complex and potentially, he didn't use the word danger, but the most complex we have faced because, unlike the Cold War when there was a nuclear arms race, and indeed unlike the post-Cold War era when there was these decades of disarmament, he said there's almost no security architecture in place. I mean, those are the rules, the handrails that guided how nuclear-armed states behaved. They were the treaties, and of course, a lot of those treaties have lapsed or are due to lapse, or the main parties, America and Russia, have withdrawn from them because they accuse the others of not abiding by their commitments. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the Chief Defence Staff, said that there are multiple concurrent dilemmas, of course, which makes this more complex. The old Cold War was, largely between Russia versus America and the West. These were the two, Russia and America, the two nuclear-armed superpowers, and their weapons were restrained by the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If one force fired their weapons, then both sides, or either the other side would retaliate and both sides would be annihilated. Now what we've seen, in Radakin's language, wild threats emanating from Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, we've seen in the last few weeks that use of the Oreshnik hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile fired from Russia onto Dnipro, a nuclear-capable missile, clearly part of Russia's sort of nuclear saber-rattling, signalling to the West its strength and capabilities. There was that moment, that 1st October in the war, that was October 2022, when there was real concern in the West, where we saw sort of shuttle diplomacy, Britain's Defence Secretary jetting out to Washington, messages being delivered to China and India by the West because there was concern Russia was on the cusp of dropping a tactical nuclear weapon either over the Black Sea or as part of its conflict in Ukraine. And just this week, we've seen new drills in the Eastern Mediterranean by Russian warships and submarines armed with these Zircon hypersonic missiles and indeed their Caliber cruise missiles. Now, these are Russian ships out of Tartus in Syria, and we're going to speak more about that in the members video in a little bit. But in terms of no handrails, it is also worth noting two reports. That one is that Russia did warn America before it fired the Oreshnik missile at Ukraine. You understand there was a phone call about 30 minutes to warn America that that missile was about to be launched so that America did not misinterpret it as a nuclear launch. And there's also reports in the New York Times that General Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of Russia's armed forces, the uniformed chief, that he spoke to his US counterpart in recent days about both that strike and the ongoing drills in the Eastern Mediterranean. So that appears that there are these channels still open to avoid accidental escalation or miscalculation. However, at the same time, we've also heard from NATO, he's saying that Russia is giving North Korea nuclear technology, or rather technology that will assist North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for those North Korean troops coming to Russia to fight in Russia against Ukraine. And that is an example perhaps of that complexity that Admiral Sir Tony Radakin was talking about. Finally, before we get on to the questions, I just want to mention one thing. The head of Britain's MI6, the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, Richard Moore, gave an extraordinary hint about Britain's support to Ukraine for covert operations. He was delivering a speech in Paris where he evoked Winston Churchill's World War II order to what was an organisation that was called the Special Operations Executive. Now, the SOE was later blended with SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, but its agents parachuted into occupied France and they carried out sabotage attacks against factories, railway lines, infrastructure that supported the Nazi war effort. Now, Sir Richard Moore said that he was very proud, that MI6 was very proud of its heritage of covert operations, and it was keeping that heritage alive by supporting Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion. Now, he gave no indication of what missions MI6 may be supporting, and officials were clear to stress that Britain is not carrying out these operations itself. But nonetheless, a very rare nugget from one of these spy chiefs when he stepped out of the shadows to talk about support for these sorts of very, very secret operations. Now, If you do have any questions and you're watching on YouTube, please do ask them in the comments below and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can next week. And as I mentioned before, there's now for the first time an opportunity for you to become a member of Frontline, and the link to do that should be coming up now, or if you go onto the Sun's YouTube page, then there's an opportunity to join Frontline there as well. The first thing I've got to address, a lot of you making the point last week about the confusion over missile ranges. It's a really fair point, because on the one hand, I was describing Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles as long range. ATACMS has a declared range of about 190 miles. That's a ground-launched missile. It's the Army tactical missile system. The Storm Shadow, a bunker-busting air-launched cruise missile, which is produced by Britain, donated to Ukraine, has a range of about 150 miles. Now, I was calling these long range. At the same time, I was discussing the intermediate range of the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile that was fired at Dnipro. It's confusing. Essentially, these are different categories of weapons. The ballistic missiles are strategic weapons. I mean, many of these are designed to carry nuclear warheads. Now, strategic nuclear weapons tend to be the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ones that can travel more than 5,500 kilometers, that can cross the Atlantic Ocean, that can basically hit anywhere on the Earth, almost anywhere, certainly in the northern hemisphere, if fired from Russian territory. Intermediate range missiles have a shorter range, but nonetheless thousands of kilometers. The reason that we were referring to the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows as long range is because these are, by its own definition, Lockheed Martin, who makes the ATACMS missile, describe it as a long range missile, but they also describe it as the Army tactical missile systems. That's what ATACMS stands for. So it's used in a sort of different purpose, much by ground commanders fighting in effectively a tactical environment. But that range of 190 miles, so significantly beyond the normal artillery range of howitzer guns, so significantly beyond the range of, for example, HIMARS rockets, which are fired from the same launchers as the ATACMS, but they have a range of about 70 miles. A fair point. Apologies for the confusion. These are different. These are weapons in sort of totally different classes, which is why a long-range tactical weapon has a much shorter range than an intermediate range sort of strategic or operational ballistic missile. A few more we'll go through a bit more quickly. Question number 2, do I think NATO troops should go into Ukraine? Well, I'm going to answer that slightly differently. There are ongoing discussions, it appears, about whether European troops might form part of some kind of peacekeeping, peace-enforcing force in the event of peace talks that freeze the conflict and establish a de facto end to the conflict. Now, whether that happens is yet to be seen. America's been very clear that American troops, Donald Trump's been very clear that American troops will not police this peace. There are persistent reports, which officials refuse really to comment on in public, that, for example, Britain and France is considering sending troops. Germany, the rumours keep bubbling up about Germany, although officials there are sort of ruling it out, but nonetheless, it appears to be under discussion. Question number 3. Are there minerals in Donetsk or in the occupied territories? Short answer, absolutely yes. The Donbass, rather than Donetsk, is Ukraine's industrial heartland. The geography of Donbass, you see it as you're driving around, these huge slag heaps as you're driving around from the old coal mines, but many of those mines are or were still operational until this conflict started. And it's not just coal, there are metals and rare earth minerals as well. This is a valuable, from an industrial point of view, a really valuable part of Ukraine. Is that the reason why the two sides are fighting? I don't think so. This does appear to be the people who know President Putin and who sort of understand or study Putin and his motives consistently come back to this idea that President Vladimir Putin has really convinced himself of a sort of misreading of history where he sees this territory as rightfully Russia's own and does not believe in Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign territory, and he thinks he's restoring Russia's former glories. Question number 4, has the average age of Russian soldiers increased and will this affect survivability? I certainly know anecdotally from the Ukrainian armed forces that the average age of their troops has increased over the course of the war. That's because so many of the soldiers who were fighting at the beginning have been killed and wounded. They've been replaced by waves of sort of voluntary mobilization. In Russia, we know that they increased the age for mobilization from the maximum age from 27 to 30 to increase the pool of people who are eligible. It is highly, highly likely, and also indeed when I met Russian prisoners of war in a prisoner of war camp in Ukraine. I mean, many of those people I met were in their 40s, and they were people who were in the Storm Z battalions, the prisoner battalions, many of them much older than your average soldier. Question number 5, should we be worried about the absence of President Putin, the suggestions he disappeared from public view? I'm not going to sort of get into the details of where he was and what he was doing. I will say that the consistent, persistent rumours about President Putin's health, we've seen him appearing puffy-faced, we've seen him twitching his foot, twitching his leg, all sorts of speculation about whether he's ill, whether he's using body doubles. I have to say, when I put these questions, when I get the opportunities to meet senior generals, senior intelligence officials, these normally conversations on background where they can, in theory, speak a little bit more freely. I have asked about this repeatedly, and the answer that comes consistently back is that they don't think these reports of his health, of serious ill health, are credible, or body doubles are credible, and there's a risk that it's wishful thinking by people who would like to see President Putin gone. And the final question today is, are Ukrainian pilots being trained to fly French Mirage jets? You'll remember France has said it will donate some of those fighter jets to Ukraine. Yes, I understand that training is taking place. The training pipeline for fast jet pilots is ultimately, you train on a basic aircraft, on a jet aircraft, and these are Ukrainian pilots who already know how to fly, but they're learning to fly to NATO standards. So in many ways, it's a series of conversion courses, and that training is happening. We haven't heard much about the F-16s. That's something some of you mentioned in the comments. That's true. There has not been much news about the F-16s. I cannot tell you why. I can only imagine they're still in the fight. They're still performing a role. It may be a Ukrainian decision just not to talk about them for the time being. Again, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible. And if you're interested in becoming a member, then do click on the links, and that'll give you opportunities, as I said, see some exclusive content. We're going to talk about what's happening in Syria, the second or the new front, perhaps, in this conflict. And you'll also get the opportunity to get badges and icons, which will help us spot your questions in the comments, help you recognise each other, separate you from the Russian bots and trolls. And look forward to answering as many of those as I can next time.